The dog's name was Echo, and he weighed 91 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and he was dying on the floor of Mercy General's emergency bay when Sloan Merritt— no, wrong name, already used— when Britta Voss walked past him without stopping. She almost made it to the supply room. Almost. Britta was 31 years old, had been an ER nurse for 6 years, and had learned early on that you did not get attached to every broken thing that came through those doors, or you would not survive this job. That was the rule. That was the practical, sensible, professionally sound rule. She repeated it to herself as her sneakers squeaked against the linoleum and her eyes stayed forward and the dog made a sound. Not a whimper, not a howl, but something quieter than both, something that sat between breathing and giving up. And Britta stopped walking. She turned around. Echo was a Belgian Malinois. She could tell by the shape of his skull, the color of his coat, fawn and black-tipped, matted now, with blood that had dried to the consistency of rust. He wore a tactical vest, olive drab, with a military patch on the left side and a serial number she couldn't read from where she stood. His handler, a young sergeant named Dade Coulter, 24 years old with a face like he hadn't slept in a week, was crouched beside him, one hand pressed to the dog's flank, the other gripping a trauma bag he clearly didn't know how to use. "He took shrapnel," Coulter said, not looking up. ID'd. 2 weeks ago in country. They said he was stable enough to transport. They said he stopped, swallowed. He stopped eating 4 days ago. Britta looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. His eyes were amber, clear despite everything, and they had the quality of someone who had seen too much and was still, somehow, paying attention. "This is a human emergency room," she said. "I know. We don't treat animals here." "I know that too." Coulter's jaw tightened. "There's a vet clinic 40 minutes from here. He won't make 40 minutes. I've already called ahead. They're sending someone, but—" he exhaled. "I just needed somewhere to stop." Britta stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4. She was aware of the ambient noise of the ER around her, the triage desk, the wheeled carts, the distant beeping of monitors, and she was aware of her supervisor's office, whose glass wall faced this corridor, and she was aware of exactly what the policy handbook said about non-human patients in a licensed medical facility. She was also aware that Echo's breathing had changed in the last 30 seconds. Shallower, faster. The kind of breathing you learn to recognize in your first year because it meant a window was closing. She walked to the supply cabinet. What she did in the next 18 minutes was not complicated, medically speaking. She irrigated the wound site, which had begun to show signs of secondary infection beneath the original trauma dressing. She administered a saline flush. She packed the wound properly. The field dressing had been applied under pressure, which was correct, but the gauze beneath had saturated and no one had changed it, which was a problem. She did not administer any controlled substances because Echo was a dog, and she did not have veterinary dosing charts, and she was not going to guess. But she stabilized what could be stabilized. She kept his airway clear. She talked to him while she worked, not in the high, soft voice people used on animals, but in her regular voice, steady and even, because she had read somewhere that military working dogs responded better to calm authority than to reassurance, and it seemed to be true because his breathing slowed by the 4th minute, and by the 10th he had stopped trying to lift his head. Coulter sat on the floor beside them the whole time and did not say anything. The vet transport arrived at minute 19. 2 technicians with a proper gurney and the right equipment. They took Echo efficiently, and with the competence of people who had done this before, and before they wheeled him out, Coulter gripped Britta's forearm, not grabbing, just pressing, for a single moment, and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was held together with significant effort. "Go with your dog," she said. He went. Britta stood up, stripped her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin. She was already mentally moving back to her patient roster. She had a chest pain in Bay 4 who needed a follow-up EKG and a possible sepsis case coming in from a nursing home, when she heard the office door open. Sandra Neff's heels were distinctive. You could hear them anywhere on the floor, that particular deliberate click that Britta had come to associate with the specific discomfort of being evaluated. Neff was the charge supervisor for the evening shift, which meant she outranked Britta in every operational sense, and she was very aware of this, and she made sure everyone else was too. She was 53, had worked in hospital administration for 22 years, and had the bearing of someone who had confused rigidity with competence so long ago that the distinction no longer existed for her. She stopped 6 feet away and looked at the floor where Echo had been, at the used supplies, at the biohazard bin. "My office," she said. Britta had expected a reprimand. She had prepared for that. She had a defense ready. The animal was in immediate distress. The proper transport was already en route. She had used only basic supplies, and no controlled medications, no human patients had been displaced or delayed. She had run through it twice on the walk to Neff's office. What she had not prepared for was how short the conversation would be. "I'm going to be direct with you," Neff said, sitting down with the precision of someone performing authority. "What you did was a violation of this facility's patient care protocols, its licensing agreements, and its liability framework. This hospital treats human beings. That is what we are licensed to do. What you did in that corridor tonight exposed this institution to potential regulatory action." "He would have died," Britta said. "That is not the point. I think it's exactly the point." Neff's expression didn't shift. "I've pulled your personnel file. This is your second formal complaint. The first was 2 years ago. You administered treatment to a patient in the waiting room before proper triage clearance. She was having a stroke. The protocol exists for a reason, Nurse Voss." Britta looked at her. "Are you firing me?" "I'm terminating your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings from your locker. Your access badge will be deactivated in approximately 10 minutes. Neff opened a drawer, removed a folder, and placed it on the desk. "The paperwork is already prepared." The word already landed somewhere in Britta's sternum and sat there. Already. Like this had been decided before the conversation started. Like the outcome had been determined the moment Neff watched through her office window and saw Britta kneel down on that floor. "I'd like to know," Britta said, and her voice was level, because she had spent 6 years learning to keep her voice level under duress, "whether there's an appeal process." "There is. The information is in your termination packet." Neff folded her hands. "I'll note that in my assessment, an appeal is unlikely to succeed given the clear documentation of the policy violation." Britta picked up the folder. She thought about saying several things. She chose none of them. She walked out. The security guard's name was Phil, and he was kind about it, which somehow made it worse. He waited outside the locker room while she changed out of her scrubs. She folded them neatly, which she would later recognize as the kind of absurd detail you notice when your brain is refusing to process the larger situation. And he walked with her to the main exit without touching her arm, which was a courtesy she appreciated. She had her car keys. She had her wallet. She had her phone, her lunch bag, the small framed photo she kept in her locker of herself and her brother taken at his boot camp graduation 3 years ago, both of them squinting into the Nevada sun, both of them grinning like idiots. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. It was 9:47 p.m. The night was cold, the kind of clear, biting cold that came to this part of Maryland in November, and the parking lot lights made everything look slightly overexposed. Her phone buzzed. A text from her roommate asking if she wanted anything from the grocery store. Britta stared at it for a long time. She did not tell her brother that night. She told herself it was because it was late and he was in the middle of an exercise rotation. She knew enough about his schedule to know that calling at 11 p.m. was inconsiderate. That was true. It was also true that she didn't want to hear his voice, because she knew if she heard his voice, she would lose the careful, constructed steadiness she had maintained since walking out of Neff's office, and she wasn't ready to lose it yet. She needed it to get her home. She needed it to make tea and sit on the couch and be very still for a while. Her brother's name was Ryan. Ryan Voss, 27, Army Ranger, currently attached to a unit she wasn't always told the specifics of because the specifics were sometimes classified. He had enlisted at 18 while Britta was halfway through nursing school, and they had argued about it once. A real argument, the kind where both of them had said things and then had to decide whether the things were true or just what fear sounded like. They had landed somewhere on the other side of that argument with a closeness that felt earned. She texted him at midnight, just, "Hey, call me when you can. Nothing urgent." She added the nothing urgent because if she didn't, he would find a way to call within the hour regardless of where he was or what he was doing, and she genuinely didn't want to be the reason for that. She went to sleep at 1 a.m. and she dreamed about the dog's amber eyes. The next morning, she called the vet clinic. She told the receptionist that she was the nurse who had stabilized Echo the previous night, and she was wondering about his condition. The receptionist put her on hold for 2 minutes and then came back and said that Echo had made it through the night, that the veterinary surgeon had been cautiously optimistic after assessing the wound, and that Sergeant Coulter had asked to be notified when Britta called. "Can you give me a number for him?" Britta asked. She got the number. She called it. Coulter picked up on the second ring. "He's going to be okay," Coulter said, and there was an exhale in those words that contained about 3 days of withheld breath. "Good," Britta said. "I'm glad." There was a pause. "I heard what happened," he said. "Someone at the hospital told me that they let you go." "Yes, because of Echo. Technically because of a policy violation, but yes, because of Echo." She was standing at her kitchen window. The neighbor's maple tree had dropped most of its leaves. They were in a wet pile against the base of her fence. "Don't carry that. It wasn't your fault." "Britta," he said. He'd gotten her name from somewhere, probably the same person who'd told him about the firing. "I'm going to make some calls." "You don't need to." "Echo has a unit," Coulter said. "He has a whole unit, and they're going to want to know what happened to the person who kept him alive." Britta thought about telling him it wasn't necessary. She thought about the dignity of handling this herself through proper channels, through the appeal process that Neff had mentioned with such evident confidence in its futility. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." She filed the appeal on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, she received a call from the hospital's HR department informing her that her appeal had been received and would be reviewed within 10 to 15 business days. On Friday, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Britta Voss?" The voice was measured, the cadence of someone accustomed to being the most composed person in a room. "Yes, my name is Commander Aldrich Vane. I'm with Naval Special Warfare. I understand you provided emergency stabilization care to Echo, a military working dog assigned to a SEAL team, on the evening of November 12th. Britta sat down. "Yes, I also understand that your employment was terminated as a result of providing that care." "That's correct." There was a brief pause. "Miss Voss, would you be available to meet on Monday morning? There are several people who would like to speak with you." She thought about the 10 to 15 business days. She thought about Sandra Neff's already prepared folder. She thought about the dog's eyes and the way Coulter had pressed her arm for one single moment, the weight of something that didn't have a word. "Yes," she said, "I'm available." She didn't know what she expected from the meeting. She told herself she had no expectations, which was a lie, but a functional one. What she expected, if she was honest, was some kind of bureaucratic courtesy. A thank you, perhaps, a formal acknowledgement, something to put in a file. What she had not expected was the conference room. The conference room was in a federal building in downtown Baltimore, nondescript from the outside, and it contained, when Britta walked in on Monday morning, 8 people. Commander Vane was there, in uniform which she recognized from the phone call as belonging to the Navy. There were 2 other officers in Navy dress. There were 2 men in civilian clothing, whose posture told you immediately that the clothing was the only civilian thing about them. There was a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as a representative from the hospital's parent healthcare organization's board. The parent company, not Mercy General itself. And there was a man beside her who was clearly a lawyer. And there was Dade Coulter, in uniform, sitting at the far end of the table, who gave her a brief nod when she came in. Britta sat down. Commander Vane spoke first. "I want to start by saying that what you did for Echo was recognized immediately by the men who work with him. A military working dog is not simply an asset. He is a member of a team, and the team responds accordingly when something happens to him." He paused. "What I'd like to discuss this morning is what happened to you afterward." The woman in the gray suit, her name was Paulette Grange. She was the regional VP of something at the parent company, spoke next. "We became aware of Nurse Voss's situation on Thursday," she said, and there was a measured carefulness in her phrasing that told Britta this was a person choosing every word. "The circumstances of her termination have been reviewed at the organizational level and," Britta said. "The termination has been reversed," Grange said, "effective immediately. Sandra Neff's handling of this situation has also been reviewed, and that review is ongoing. You'll be reinstated at your previous position, with full back pay for the period of your absence and a formal letter of recognition in your personnel file. The lawyer beside her placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Britta. She didn't open it yet. She looked at Vane. Can I ask what specifically changed? Between the appeal and now? Vane exchanged a look with one of the men in civilian clothing, and the man who had not introduced himself and did not introduce himself now, but who had the particular economy of movement of someone whose entire professional life had been built around the principle of controlled force, said, "Let's say that the people who work with Echo made the nature of the situation very clear to the appropriate parties." Britta looked at the folder. She looked at Coulter, who was watching her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was mostly succeeding. She looked at the two Navy officers, and the lawyer, and Paulette Grange with her gray suit and her careful words. "I want to make sure I understand," Britta said. "Did members of the Naval Special Warfare community contact the hospital's parent organization directly?" "That is one way to describe what occurred," Vane said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood. She would learn more details later, over the course of several conversations, some with Coulter and some with people she met through Coulter. What had happened, assembled from fragments and told with the particular economy of people who did not over-explain, was this. On the Saturday after the firing, Coulter had made calls. The calls had traveled the way. Calls traveled through a unit, through loyalty and habit and the understanding that what happened to one member was relevant information to all members. By Sunday, 3 members of Echo's team had made contact with Mercy General's administration, not as a formal communication, but in person, which was a different thing entirely. They had been entirely professional. They had also been, by all accounts, unmistakably clear about who they were, what Echo meant to them, and what they thought about the person who had kept him alive being removed from her position because of it. The hospital's parent organization had received a phone call on Sunday evening from someone in a position whose title Britta was not told, but whose call had been taken immediately. By Monday morning, Paulette Grange had been on 3 flights. Britta went back to work on a Wednesday. The ER was the same as she had left it, loud and bright and perpetually on the edge of organized chaos. And her colleagues were careful with her for the first hour and then forgot to be careful, which was exactly what she wanted. She was in Bay 3, reviewing labs for a patient with an elevated troponin when Phil the security guard appeared in the doorway. "You've got someone at the front desk," he said. "Says he's not a patient." She went to the front desk. Coulter was standing there in civilian clothes, jeans, a worn canvas jacket, with Echo on a leash beside him. The dog was thinner than he had been, still bearing the evidence of what had happened to him, but he was standing, all 4 legs, with the careful deliberateness of an animal that has decided the world still warrants engagement. "He wanted to see you," Coulter said. Britta crouched down, level with Echo. Up close, his eyes were exactly as she remembered, amber, clear, paying attention in a way that made you feel accounted for. She put her hand out, palm down. He sniffed it. Then he placed his chin on her knee with a steadiness that felt like something more than the behavior of an animal. It felt like a decision. "Hey, buddy," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, and she was absolutely not going to cry in the emergency room entrance. She was mostly successful. Coulter cleared his throat. He passed his medical clearance yesterday, still has some recovery ahead, but he stopped. He wouldn't have had any recovery ahead without what you did. Britta straightened up. She looked at Coulter, who was 24 years old and had a face like he hadn't slept in a week and probably still hadn't slept enough in the weeks since, and she thought about all the things that were true simultaneously. That the system had tried to punish her for doing the right thing, that it had not succeeded, that there were people in the world who believed that the right thing was worth showing up for in conference rooms and on Sunday phone calls and on floors of emergency rooms at 9 p.m., and that a 91-pound dog with amber eyes had turned out to be, in some very literal sense, the reason she still had her job. "He did most of the work," she said. Coulter smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It changed his whole face. "Yeah," he said. "He tends to." She walked them out to the parking lot, a breach of approximately 4 different protocols, none of which she particularly regretted, and watched Coulter load Echo carefully into the back seat of a truck with the gentleness of someone who understood the weight of what they were carrying. She thought about her brother. She thought about the photo in her locker, the two of them squinting into Nevada sunlight, and about the fact that the world was full of people who put themselves in harm's way and came back different, and the people who loved them and tried to hold something steady while they were gone. She had a patient in Bay 3. She had labs to review. She had 6 years of knowing how to keep her voice even under pressure, and a personnel file that now contained a formal letter saying she had done the right thing. She went back inside.